Not knowing what happens in individual urology training residencies, it is sometimes difficult for me to give recommendations or suggestions. However, in general, there are some truths regarding urology training and versus reality. This past weekend, I was at the Arizona Urologic Society meeting in Scottsdale, where I met one of the residents going through the training program, and he asked me, what do I need to know once I get out of my training? I believe he was interested in oncology. He may be going further into his training with a fellowship. I'm not sure. But in general, he wanted to know, what do I need to be aware of once I get done with my urology residency training? This is a conversation that I've had with numerous physicians, and it is always interesting because what happens during residency and what happens in real life after you get done through residency can be quite disparate. For instance, during residency, I don't know about you all, but I wanted to be in the operating room and spend as much time as I can in the operating room. And whenever there's clinic going on, I wanted to avoid clinic. And if you keep that mindset going into private practice, it may or may not work depending on your position. If you're hired on, or if you sign on to perform big oncologic surgeries and you are designed, your position is designed for you to be in the operating room the whole time, and very importantly, your compensation, your remuneration, and how your group is evaluating your productivity. If that is taken into account based on your production in the operating room, and knowing that your production is likely going to be less in the operating room versus someone who spends more time in the clinic, if that's taken into account, then you should be okay. This resident also wondered, maybe going into academics, how that is going to influence how he is evaluated. Well, academics, private practice, they're similar in that it's most likely going to be production-based, meaning you can't just sit on your butt and do nothing and expect to collect a large salary. Basically, typically, there's a base salary and a production bonus, if you will. And sometimes there's a production penalty. If you produce lower than a certain threshold, then your payment, your salary may be decreased for a period of time. Which brings me to the next point. One of the things I always recommend that the residents have a good understanding and good grasp, and I know it is difficult because during residency, you're just studying for in-service. You're trying to survive call in 80-hour call weeks. I don't know how it is now, but things have really softened nowadays. But back in the day, 80, 100-hour work weeks are not uncommon. But you're trying to get through your work week. You're trying to study for in-service. You're trying to take care of patients in clinic and trying to read up on cases in the operating room. That's your residency and that's your life. But once you get out into reality, then you have to start looking at your numbers, your production metrics, and how that is calculated is through something called wRVUs, work relative value units. And this goes into coding and billing. You have to understand how your work is being valued or evaluated. And there are certain things that are valued more highly, and there are certain things that are not valued as highly, even though the amount of work effort required, the amount of time required is much greater, and yet you are not, your valuation or RVUs or work RVUs for whatever you do for that procedure, which takes longer and more difficult intellectually, physically, that unfortunately is not remunerated as highly, nor is it remunerated equitably. So that is the reality, and that is why it's important for residents and, frankly, all physicians to understand how your work is evaluated and valued or not valued. And then you need to adjust your work, your schedule, your staffing, and sometimes your life goals and plans accordingly. Because as many business people have realized, if there's no margin, there's no mission. And I like to say it this way: your success or your patient's success depends on your success. Your patient's success depends on your success. That way, that's what I mean when I say that you have to be aware of how your work is being valued or not valued, how certain types of work are being more highly valued or undervalued. A good understanding of how the rules are set up allows you to behave accordingly so that you can continue serving your patients so that you're not burned out. So when it comes to residency, your set of values are very different than once you get out of residency. In reality, when really the buck stops with your employer, they're going to be the ones who dictate how many patients you see, how fast you see them, what quality metrics you need to meet. So for those of you looking at an employed position, being an employee, those are some of the realities that you need to be aware of. Coding and billing aspects, the amount of the work that you produce, how some types of work are undervalued and some types of work are overvalued, and what type of work will you be doing? Are you going to be doing the type of work that is undervalued or more highly valued? And if you're going to be stuck doing the work that is more undervalued, how is the practice going to adjust or compensate for that undervaluation? Because you are providing a valuable service to the group. Not everyone is doing these, say, for instance, oncology, big wax, big surgeries. So if they're not doing it, you end up assuming the burden and then you're being penalized. Well, that doesn't seem to be fair in a group practice. So you need to be aware of that scenario. And again, understanding coding and billing, the current valuation system in the U.S. healthcare, and how that is not always fair to the urologist, who's doing providing a particular type of service. That type of understanding is essential. The other advice that I have for residents just coming out of training is that you should continue to live like a resident. You should continue to live like a resident, especially financially. I understand the lure of buying that McMansion and buying that fancy car is there because you're going from a very low salary to a large salary. But you really need to continue to live like a resident. Most of us have student loans. When I finished training, I had over $200,000 in student loans. Maybe you're not one of those who's not so fortunate, but most of us have loans, and you need to continue to live like a resident so you can service those loans because they're going to be coming due. The forbearance period is going away once you get out of training and you start making a salary as an attending. So you got to make sure that you can service your existing debt before you start taking on more debt. When you take on that extra debt from the McMansion or the house or the fancy car that you purchase, then you're kind of stuck because you have to service that additional debt. What ends up happening is you become a slave to your job. You become a slave to your job because you can't quit. If you quit, then you can't service the debt. You can't pay off your loans. You can't pay off the monthly payments. So I urge my newly trained urologists to continue to live like a resident. Don't spend the big money. Don't sign on for huge commitments. Heck, when I first finished training and I took on my first job, we did not purchase a house right away. We rented, and then we purchased the house. And when I moved from that location, we again rented first to make sure that everything's going to work out before I sign on the dotted line and purchase the house at the height of the housing bubble. But the bottom line is you want to consider continuing to live like a resident, continue to exercise financial intelligence instead of just buying stuff because you now have a little bit of income. So anyway, I hope that brings some perspective once you get out of training. And as usual, if you have any questions or comments, leave them below. And for those of you watching on YouTube, if you want 30 ways to increase your margin, please click on this video link over here. Take care, be well. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. Please take care of yourself and take care of each other. Bye-bye.